Every story has an inciting incident, though sometimes the inciting incident takes place before the story starts. But what is the inciting incident? Well, it's the event or occurrence or revelation that makes the protagonist realise that they have a problem or that they really want something. Before the inciting incident, they were not aware of their problem or that they needed something. And you have to make sure that your inciting incident is big enough for your character not to be able to turn back at any stage of the story. They certainly shouldn't be able to shrug their shoulders when the inciting incident occurs and say, "So what?" During the class on conflict, we used Humpty Dumpty as an example. Let's do so again. So here's the first line. Humpty Dumpty sat on the wall. There's little happening. Yeah, certainly no inciting incident. But then Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. This is the inciting incident. Is it big enough? Of course. Humpty cannot ignore this. Even if he wished to, he's hurtling to the ground. Let's look at another couple of examples from well-known stories. In the first Harry Potter book, the inciting incident is Harry reading the letter that informs him that he's a wizard. It changes his life. He cannot ignore this information. In the classic film Jaws, the inciting incident is the arrival of the shark and taking its first victim. Again, something that can't be ignored. In just about every crime or detective story, the inciting incident is the discovery of a body, and the detective cannot ignore it. It's their job to solve the murder. Write down the names of 5 of your favourite novels or movies and then identify the inciting incident for each of them. The inciting incident should come close to the beginning of the story, but not right at the start. That's because you need to set up the protagonist's normal world. Otherwise, the reader is not going to know the extent to which the protagonist's world is going to be changed by the inciting incident. Let's say you want to write a story about a character who's diagnosed with a terminal disease. You start with the protagonist being told the news by her doctor. The reader will obviously feel some sympathy. Now consider moving this scene to chapter 2 and having chapter 1 showing the woman at home before her trip to the doctor, single-handedly managing 3 small children with a caring, patient manner. When the reader gets to the doctor's diagnosis, they're going to feel much more deeply for the mother than with the original chapter 1. They know how the news is going to affect her life and the lives of those around her. Now note, when I say we have to show someone's normal life first, normal does not necessarily mean good. It just means the protagonist's regular routine in life. It may be damn miserable. Let's face it, Harry Potter's normal world was hardly one of happiness and luxury. So the inciting incident leads the character into a different world. This makes it easy for your story to have a lot of conflict. Your protagonist needs to navigate their way through the unfamiliar. So we see the protagonist in their normal world, then something happens to propel them into a different world where they will be challenged and experience change. There are some stories where the inciting incident takes place before the story begins. This is more common in short stories and plays than in extended stories. I don't suggest trying this until you are more experienced as a writer. A story's inciting incident inevitably leads to the protagonist having a goal. This could be something your protagonist wants or a problem that the protagonist has to solve. It's the point of the story. Harry Potter's goal was to destroy Lord Voldemort. In Jaws, the goal is to kill the shark. In Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, Charles Marlowe's goal is to track down Kurtz. Go back to the previous exercise where you identified the inciting incidents for 5 of your favourite stories. Now, try to identify the goals that the protagonists for each of these stories had as a result of the inciting incident. Of course, you need to make sure that the goal is as unachievable as possible for the protagonist for most of the story. You need to put barriers in the way. There may be also small goals along the way, but there needs to be an overarching goal. Don't confuse the two. Short-term goals are often a way to explore the protagonist's character and emotional makeup. Now, sometimes the main goal changes within a story, usually as a result of the original goal being achieved or the parameters changing. For example, a protagonist may be a lawyer whose goal is to get his client off a trumped-up charge. When the lawyer's client is found dead, the lawyer suspects his client was killed by a crooked police officer and tries to prove this, so the goal has changed. You also need to decide whether or not your protagonist is going to succeed in achieving their goal. Why would you choose for them not to? Well, this is linked to the question, how do you want your audience to feel at the end of your story? Do you want them to feel warm inside? In which case you almost inevitably have to have the protagonist get what they are after. Do you want them to be questioning things? In which case maybe the outcome can be interpreted in different ways. Do you want them to be riled up and keen to act on some sort of issue? In which case, give them an ending that will drive them this way. We have established that as a result of the inciting incident, your protagonist has a goal. And in pursuing this goal, you, as the writer, need to put as many obstacles as you can in their way. That's the conflict. There's one more thing I want to add to this formula before we move on to the next step of writing stories, and that is the notion of change. It is essential that your main character or characters change throughout the story. By the end, they must be very different from the way they were at the beginning. Why? Because for a person to endure the hardships they inevitably will during a story and to emerge unchanged or unscathed is completely unrealistic. People behave and act the way they do. Their personalities are formed because of their life's experiences. We are who we are because of the trials we have had to face throughout our lives. And we constantly change. We are constantly learning. So to appear realistic, as your characters need to, they too must change. Now, there are many forms that this change can take. There is geographical change, where the character ends up in a different location than where they started. Then there is physical change, and the character dying is the ultimate example of physical change. There's intellectual change, when a major intellectual discovery has been made, maybe a eureka moment. There is emotional change, such as falling in love, and spiritual change. Your character may change in a number of these ways. You do not have to restrict it to one. The best way to show how your protagonist has changed at the end of the story compared to how they were at the beginning is to continue the story a little way after the climax. Readers aren't so much interested in what happens at the end. As I've pointed out, they can usually guess at the start what's going to happen. They are interested in two other aspects. They are interested in seeing how the protagonist deals with all the conflict. But equally, they want to see how the protagonist reacts to the climax. This is where their change is often most apparent. This is also where their emotions are often at their rawest. I'll give you an example from real life rather than a story, just this once. The lesson's the same though, whether real life or fiction. So when I watch a football grand final or some other sporting contests, where the stakes are very high, I do so with only moderate interest until towards the end, where my interest is heightened. The peak of my interest kicks in when the final whistle or the siren sounds, because that's when the emotion flows. The victors, they're ecstatic, but it's the losers' reactions that fascinate me the most. They've struggled and struggled for the season. Many players for several years to get to that point, yet they've fallen short. Now, call me a masochist if you like, but if the TV broadcast ended with the climax, that is, the end of the match, the siren, I'm going to be left very unsatisfied. I don't get to see that resolution. I don't get to see those reactions. And so it is with a story. This issue of change emphasises how important it is to plan your story before you start. If you haven't considered what sort of character arc that you want, how can you ensure that you're going to get there?